Thank you for purchasing a ghost kit from 4-Bit Industries. These instructions will show you how to solder it up. There are not a lot of components in this kit, so it is a quick job. In your kit, you should find 2 wires stripped at one end, battery holder, 2 capacitors, a chip and socket, switch, 4 resistors, and the PCB. We will start with the 4 resistors. I like to cut mine away from the tape. All 4 of these resistors are identical, and resistors are non-polarized, so it's impossible to insert them backwards. So what we're going to do is bend the leads down, and we're going to look for these footprints on the PCB that say 10K. We're going to bend the leads so we can insert them like so. And then you can bend the leads outwards on the back to hold it into place for soldering. Now you can insert and solder these one at a time, or you can insert all 4 and solder them all at once. Again, these are not polarized, but for aesthetic reasons you may want to insert them all in the same direction. That's up to you. To solder these, you may want to tape the board down to the table if you don't have a vise for soldering. With a clean iron tip, I'll put a little bit of solder on the end of my iron, touch it to the pad and the lead, let it heat up, flow in some solder, remove the solder, remove the iron, and that did not entirely seem to take. There we go. If you find that the solder is only clinging to your iron, make sure your iron is clean and that you are touching both the pad and the lead, getting them both sufficiently hot that the solder will take. Flow is the word they use. Okay, now one thing you can look for on your solder joints is flip it over to the other side and see, did the solder flow through the hole and up the lead a little bit? It can even cover the pad on the top side, and that's actually a good sign of proper heating of the joint to make sure that the solder fully bonds. So now we'll go ahead and do the other 3. Losing my tape there. Once you've soldered all 4 of them, you can trim the leads. Try not to trim through the solder joint. Trim it just above. The goal is to make sure that no 2 leads could possibly touch each other. Alright, next we're going to solder the chip socket. So you'll notice that the chip socket has a notch in one end, and that notch matches a little notch that's drawn on the footprint on the PCB. So insert the chip socket so that the notches are at the same end. And then you may want to go ahead and tape this down. You can try bending the leads, but I find taping it down does a good job of holding it in place. That said, when you go to solder it, solder just 1 lead to start with. And then check it to make sure that the chip socket is still flush against the board. If it's riding up, if you can't feel all the pins coming through the board, then you can reheat that 1 joint and push it into position carefully with some sort of heat-safe tool, or just being careful not to singe your fingers, because the socket will get hot. And then you can go ahead and solder the other 8 pins. Okay. Next I'm going to install the switch. This one tends to hold itself in pretty well, because those feet at either end kind of fit snugly in those holes. But if not, you can tape this in place also. I will go ahead and solder the 3 electrical connections first. And then solder in the 2 legs. This is for mechanical strength. You do have to flow a lot of solder in there to get that hole to fill in. But as long as you have your iron on the pad and the leg, it should get hot enough to solder. Okay, now let's move on to the capacitors. So first we'll deal with the film capacitor. This is in a white rectangular body. You'll notice it says 10 in on it, and that goes into the spot marked 10 in on the PCB. And you can bend those legs just a little bit to hold it in. The ceramic capacitor, on the other hand, very hard to read the writing on this because it's very small. That goes directly underneath the chip socket in the spot marked 100 in. My switch is still a little hot. Yours may be too. And now we'll solder this into place. Alright, that one's soldered better than this one. And then we can trim those leads. what is left? Well, the battery holder is a little different than the other things here. Go ahead and inspect these solder joints. Make sure they look good to you, that they're touching the pad and the lead, because once we put this battery holder on, it's going to cover them up. Now, there are holes here for number 2 screws to hold the battery holder on. I found that it holds on more than well enough with just the solder joints, so we haven't included any screws with this kit. But again, these are pretty big holes. You're going to need a lot of solder. But you should get a nice thick solder joint like that one. There we go. And then once that's cooled, you can snip the leads off. Just 2 more things to do. We have our wire, which acts as an antenna. Just stick that in and then bend it to the right. The other one you can stick in and bend it to the left. I'm going to go ahead and tape these into place so that they don't fall out while I'm soldering. You don't want to bend the leads too much. Don't bend them back and forth, or these wires could break. As you're handling it, hiding it somewhere to play hide and seek with it, if you need to bend the wire, just hold it with 2 fingers and bend it further out from the joint. Get a good amount of solder on these. And they should solder up quite nicely. We are almost done. We now need to insert our chip. Now, the chip tends to come with its legs kind of splayed out. So to straighten them, I roll it against the table to sort of bend all the legs on one side at once. Try to get them facing straight down. That might even be bent a little bit in, but that should be okay. And then look on the chip either for a dot, which will be near pin 1, or a notch in the end of the chip. Whether you have a dot or a notch, they both go up towards the notch in the holder, in the IC socket. And you want all 8 legs to go in. The chip should sit down against the socket like this. There will be a slight gap, but make sure all 8 legs have gone into the socket. I'll put the switch in the off position, and then I will find a 9-volt battery. So how do we use the Ghost? First, I will add a 9-volt battery, and then turn it on. You won't have any way of knowing it's turned on unless you have a ghost detector. So let's turn this off and calibrate our ghost detector. You recall you turn the sensitivity all the way up by turning this counterclockwise. Then we turn it down until the yellow one turns off. And we should do that with the ghost off. Now if I turn the ghost on and bring the ghost detector close. Already at this distance, the yellow light is flashing. And then as I get closer, the red light turns on too. So you can use your ghost to test your ghost detector. Keep in mind, if you hide the ghost inside of a metal enclosure, it's going to block all the radio waves, and so you won't be able to detect it. But you should be able to detect it through wood or plastic.